Hello, everyone. Today's chess puzzle, we've got a fascinating board position here, ripe with possibilities.
Mhm.
Let's set the scene. For white, we have a knight on e5, another knight on e4, pawn on f4, another pawn on g4, the queen's sitting pretty on h4, then pawns on c3, d3, and b2, a bishop's holding down d2, another pawn on h2, the rook's on d1, and the white king's chilling on g1. Now, for black, we've got a rook on f8, the king on g8, bishop on b7, pawn on f7, another pawn on g7, and one more on h7. The black queen staring down the board from b6, a bishop on d6, pawns on e6, b5, and c5, and finally, a knight on f6. Let's get this going.
Right away. A few things pop out. White's knights are really well positioned. They're putting pressure on black's king side, and that queen on b6 looks a little precarious.
Yeah, and black's king doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. Those pawns in front of him are pretty much locked in place.
Exactly. So for white, the goal is to find a way to exploit those weaknesses. We need to create a threat that forces black's hand and opens up an avenue for checkmate.
Gotcha. So what's the first move to set this trap in motion?
The answer is knight e4 to f6.
There you go. Knight e4 to f6. All right, let's walk through this step by step. So white jumps the knight to f6. What does black do?
Black's most logical response is pawn g7 to f6, capturing the knight.
Okay, so pawn g7 takes f6. Then what?
White follows up with knight e5 to d7.
Interesting. Knight e5 to d7. So now white's knight is sitting right next to black's queen. What's black's move now?
Black has to protect their queens, so they play queen b6 to c6.
Right, queen b6 to c6. It's getting tense.
Now white plays the key move, knight d7 to f6. This forces a check of the black king.
I see. Knight d7 to f6, check. What does black do now?
Black's only option is to move their king out of check. So king g8 to g7.
Makes sense. King g8 to g7. What's next for white?
White continues the attack with knight f6 to h5.
Knight f6 to h5. So white's really going after the black king here.
Yes. And black's in a tough spot. They move their king again, king g7 to h8.
Yeah, so on g7 to h8.
White now delivers a crushing blow. Queen h4 to f6, checking the king again.
Wow. Queen h4 to f6, check. Black's really running out of space.
They are. They're forced to move the king back to g8. King h8 to g8.
King h8 to g8. And white's final move.
With queen f6 to g7.
Checkmate.
Queen f6 to g7. Checkmate. Beautiful. That was a really instructive sequence.
It really showcases the power of developing your pieces
Yeah,
and coordinating an attack.
absolutely. Thank you for listening.